War and Peace, First Epilogue, Chapter 9, read for LibriVox.org by Kate Mackenzie. It was the eve of St. Nicholas, the 5th of December, 1820. Natasha had been staying at her brother's with her husband and children since early autumn. Pierre had gone to Petersburg on business of his own for 3 weeks, as he said, but had remained there nearly 7 weeks and was expected back every minute. Besides the Bezúkhov family, Nicholas's old friend, the retired general Vasíli Dmítrich Denísov, was staying with the Rostóvs this 5th of December. On the 6th, which was his name day, when the house would be full of visitors, Nicholas knew he would have to exchange his Tartar tunic for a tail-coat, and put on narrow boots with pointed toes, and drive to the new church he had built, and then receive visitors who would come to congratulate him, offer them refreshments, and talk about the elections of the nobility. But he considered himself entitled to spend the eve of that day in his usual way. He examined the bailiff's accounts of the village in Ryazan, which belonged to his wife's nephew, wrote 2 business letters, and walked over to the granaries, cattle yards and stables before dinner. Having taken precautions against the general drunkenness to be expected on the morrow, because it was a great saint's day, he returned to dinner, and without having time for a private talk with his wife, sat down at the long table laid for 20 persons, at which the whole household had assembled. At that table were his mother, his mother's old lady companion Belóva, his wife, their 3 children, with their governess and tutor, his wife's nephew with his tutor, Sónya, Denísov, Natasha, her 3 children, their governess, and old Michael Ivánovich, the late prince's architect, who was living on in retirement at Bald Hills. Countess Mary sat at the other end of the table. When her husband took his place, she concluded, from the rapid manner in which after taking up his table napkin he pushed back the tumbler and wine-glass standing before him, that he was out of humour, as was sometimes the case when he came into dinner straight from the farm, especially before the soup. Countess Mary well knew that mood of his, and when she herself was in a good frame of mind, quietly waited till he had had his soup, and then began to talk to him and make him admit that there was no cause for his ill humour. But today she quite forgot that, and was hurt that he should be angry with her without any reason, and she felt unhappy. She asked him where he had been. He replied. She again inquired whether everything was going well on the farm. Her unnatural tone made him wince unpleasantly, and he replied hastily. "Then I'm not mistaken," thought Countess Mary. "Why is he cross with me?" She concluded from his tone that he was vexed with her and wished to end the conversation. She knew her remark sounded unnatural, but could not refrain from asking some more questions. Thanks to Denísov, the conversation at table soon became general and lively, and she did not talk to her husband. When they left the table and went as usual to thank the old countess, Countess Mary held out her hand and kissed her husband, and asked him why he was angry with her. "You always have such strange fancies. I didn't even think of being angry," he replied. But the word always seemed to her to imply, "Yes, I am angry, but I won't tell you why." Nicholas and his wife lived together so happily that even Sónya and the old countess, who felt jealous and would have liked them to disagree, could find nothing to reproach them with. But even they had their moments of antagonism. Occasionally, and it was always just after they had been happiest together, they suddenly had a feeling of estrangement and hostility, which occurred most frequently during Countess Mary's pregnancies, and this was such a time. "Well, messieurs et mesdames," said Nicholas loudly and with apparent cheerfulness, it seemed to Countess Mary that he did it on purpose to vex her, "I have been on my feet since 6 this morning. Tomorrow I shall have to suffer, so today I'll go and rest." And without a word to his wife, he went to the little sitting room and lay down on the sofa. "That's always the way," thought Countess Mary. "He talks to everyone except me. I see that I am repulsive to him, especially when I'm in this condition." She looked down at her expanded figure, and in the glass at her pale, sallow, emaciated face in which her eyes now looked larger than ever. And everything annoyed her: Denísov's shouting and laughter, Natásha's talk, and especially a quick glance Sónya gave her. Sónya was always the first excuse Countess Mary found for feeling irritated. Having sat a while with her visitors, without understanding anything of what they were saying, she softly left the room and went to the nursery. The children were playing at going to Moscow in a carriage made of chairs, and invited her to go with them. She sat down and played with them a little, but the thought of her husband and his unreasonable crossness worried her. She got up and, walking on tiptoe with difficulty, went to the small sitting-room. "Perhaps he is not asleep. I'll have an explanation with him," she said to herself. Little Andrew, her eldest boy, imitating his mother, followed her on tiptoe. She did not notice him. "Mary, dear, I think he is asleep. He was so tired," said Sónya, meeting her in the large sitting-room. It seemed to Countess Mary that she crossed her path everywhere. "Andrew may wake him." Countess Mary looked round, saw little Andrew following her, felt that Sónya was right, and for that very reason flushed, and with evident difficulty refrained from saying something harsh. She made no reply, but to avoid obeying Sónya, beckoned to Andrew to follow her quietly and went to the door. Sónya went away by another door. From the room in which Nicholas was sleeping came the sound of his even breathing, every slightest tone of which was familiar to his wife. As she listened to it she saw before her his smooth, handsome forehead, his moustache, and his whole face, as she had so often seen it in the stillness of the night when he slept. Nicholas suddenly moved and cleared his throat, and at that moment little Andrew shouted from outside the door, "Papa! Mamma's standing here!" Countess Mary turned pale with fright and made signs to the boy. He grew silent, and quiet ensued for a moment, terrible to Countess Mary. She knew how Nicholas disliked being waked. Then through the door she heard Nicholas clearing his throat again and stirring, and his voice said crossly, "I can't get a moment's peace. Mary, is that you? Why did you bring him here?" "I only came in to look and did not notice. Forgive me." Nicholas coughed and said no more. Countess Mary moved away from the door and took the boy back to the nursery. 5 minutes later, little black-eyed 3-year-old Natasha, her father's pet, having learned from her brother that Papa was asleep and Mamma was in the sitting-room, ran to her father unobserved by her mother. The dark-eyed little girl boldly opened the creaking door, went up to the sofa with energetic steps of her sturdy little legs, and having examined the position of her father, who was asleep with his back to her, rose on tiptoe and kissed the hand which lay under his head. Nicholas turned with a tender smile on his face. "Natásha, Natásha!" came Countess Mary's frightened whisper from the door. "Papa wants to sleep." "No, Mamma, he doesn't want to sleep," said little Natásha with conviction. "He's laughing." Nicholas lowered his legs, rose, and took his daughter in his arms. "Come in, Mary," he said to his wife. She went in and sat down by her husband. "I did not notice him following me," she said timidly. "I just looked in." Holding his little girl with one arm, Nicholas glanced at his wife and, seeing her guilty expression, put his other arm around her and kissed her hair. "May I kiss Mamma?" he asked Natásha. Natásha smiled bashfully. "Again!" she commanded, pointing with a peremptory gesture to the spot where Nicholas had placed the kiss. "I don't know why you think I am cross," said Nicholas, replying to the question he knew was in his wife's mind. "You have no idea how unhappy, how lonely I feel when you are like that. It always seems to me—" "Mary, don't talk nonsense. You ought to be ashamed of yourself," he said gaily. "It seems to be that you can't love me, that I am so plain always, and now in this Oh, how absurd you are! It is not beauty that endears, it's love that makes us see beauty. It is only Malvinus and Wearne of that kind who will love for their beauty. But do I love my wife? I don't love her, but I don't know how to put it. Without you, or when something comes between us like this, I seem lost and can't do anything. Now, do I love my finger? I don't love it, but just try to cut it off. I'm not like that myself, but I understand. So you're not angry with me?" "Awfully angry," he said, smiling and getting up, and smoothing his hair he began to pace the room. "Do you know, Mary, what I've been thinking?" he began, immediately thinking aloud in his wife's presence, now that they had made it up. He did not ask if she was ready to listen to him, he did not care. A thought had occurred to him, and so it belonged to her also, and he told her of his intention to persuade Pierre to stay with them till spring. Countess Mary listened till he had finished, made some remark, and in her turn began thinking aloud. Her thoughts were about the children. "You can see the woman in her already," she said in French, pointing to little Natásha. "You reproach us women with being illogical. Here is our logic. I say, 'Papa wants to sleep,' but she says, 'No, he's laughing.' And she was right," said Countess Mary with a happy smile. "Yes, yes." And Nicholas, taking his little daughter in his strong hand, lifted her high, placed her on his shoulder, held her by the legs, and paced the room with her. There was an expression of carefree happiness on the faces of both father and daughter. "But you know you may be unfair. You are too fond of this one," his wife whispered in French. "Yes, but what am I to do? I try not to show." At that moment they heard the sound of the door pulley and footsteps in the hall and anteroom, as if someone had arrived. "Somebody has come. I am sure it is Pierre. I will go and see," said Countess Mary, and left the room. In her absence Nicholas allowed himself to give his little daughter a gallop round the room. Out of breath he took the laughing child quickly from his shoulder and pressed her to his heart. His capers reminded him of dancing, and looking at the child's round happy little face he thought of what she would be like when he was an old man, taking her into society and dancing the mazurka with her as his old father had danced Daniel Cooper with his daughter. It is he, Nicholas!" said Countess Mary, re-entering the room a few minutes later. "Now our Natásha has come to life. You should have seen her ecstasy, and how he caught it for having stayed away so long. Well, come along now, quick, quick! It's time you two were parted," she added, looking smilingly at the little girl who clung to her father. Nicholas went out holding the child by the hand. Countess Mary remained in the sitting room. "I should never, never have believed that one could be so happy," she whispered to herself. A smile lit up her face, but at the same time she sighed, and her deep eyes expressed a quiet sadness, as though she felt, through her happiness, that there is another sort of happiness unattainable in this life, and of which she involuntarily thought at that instant. End of chapter 9. This recording is in the public domain.
War and Peace, First Epilogue, Chapter 10, read for LibriVox.org. Natasha had married in the early spring of 1813, and in 1820 already had 3 daughters, besides a son for whom she had longed, and whom she was now nursing. She had grown stouter and broader, so that it was difficult to recognize in this robust, motherly woman the slim, lively Natasha of former days. Her features were more defined and had a calm, soft, and serene expression. In her face there was none of the ever-glowing animation that had formerly burned there and constituted its charm. Now her face and body were often all that one saw, and her soul was not visible at all. All that struck the eye was a strong, handsome, and fertile woman. The old fire rarely kindled in her face now. That happened only when, as was the case that day, her husband returned home, or a sick child was convalescent, or when she and Countess Mary spoke of Prince Andrew. She never mentioned him to her husband, who she imagined was jealous of Prince Andrew's memory. Or on the rare occasions when something happened to induce her to sing, a practice she had quite abandoned since her marriage. At the rare moments when the old fire did kindle in her handsome, fully developed body, she was even more attractive than in former days. Since their marriage, Natasha and her husband had lived in Moscow, in Petersburg, on their estate near Moscow, or with her mother, that is to say, in Nicholas's house. The young Countess Bezúkhova was not often seen in society, and those who met her there were not pleased with her and found her neither attractive nor amiable. Not that Natasha liked solitude. She did not know whether she liked it or not. She even thought that she did not. But with her pregnancies, her confinements, the nursing of her children, and sharing every moment of her husband's life, she had demands on her time which could be satisfied only by renouncing society. All who had known Natasha before her marriage wondered at the change in her as at something extraordinary. Only the old countess, with her maternal instinct, had realized that all Natasha's outbursts had been due to her need of children and a husband, as she herself had once exclaimed at Otradnoye, not so much in fun as in earnest. and her mother was now surprised at the surprise expressed by those who had never understood Natasha, and she kept saying that she had always known that Natasha would make an exemplary wife and mother. "Only she lets her love of her husband and children overflow all bounds," said the countess, "so that it even becomes absurd." Natasha did not follow the golden rule advocated by clever folk, especially by the French, which says that a girl should not let herself go when she marries, should not neglect her accomplishments, should be ever more careful of her appearance than when she was unmarried, and should fascinate her husband as much as she did before he became her husband. Natasha, on the contrary, had at once abandoned all her witchery, of which her singing had been an unusually powerful part. She gave it up just because it was so powerfully seductive. She took no pains with her manners, or with delicacy of speech, or with her toilet, or to show herself to her husband in her most becoming attitudes, or to avoid inconveniencing him by being too exacting. She acted in contradiction to all those rules. She felt that the allurements instinct had formerly taught her to use would now be merely ridiculous in the eyes of her husband, to whom she had from the first moment given up herself entirely. That is, with her whole soul, leaving no corner of it hidden from him. She felt that her unity with her husband was not maintained by the poetic feeling that had attracted him to her, but by something else, indefinite but firm as the bond between her own body and soul. To fluff out her curls, put on fashionable dresses, and sing romantic songs to fascinate her husband would have seemed as strange as to adorn herself to attract herself. To adorn herself for others might perhaps have been agreeable, she did not know, but she had no time at all for it. The chief reason for devoting no time either to singing, to dress, or to choosing her words was that she really had no time to spare for these things. We know that man has the faculty of becoming completely absorbed in a subject, however trivial it might be, and that there is no subject so trivial that it will not grow to infinite proportions if one's entire attention is devoted to it. The subject which wholly engrossed Natasha's attention was her family, that is, her husband whom she had to keep so that he should belong entirely to her and to the home, and the children whom she had to bear, bring into the world, nurse, and bring up. And the deeper she penetrated, not with her mind only, but with her whole soul, her whole being, into the subject that absorbed her, the larger did that subject grow, and the weaker and more inadequate did her powers appear, so that she concentrated them wholly on that one thing, and yet was unable to accomplish all that she considered necessary. There were then, as now, discussions and conversations about women's rights, the relations of husband and wife, and their freedom and rights, though these themes were not yet termed questions, as they are now. But these topics were not merely uninteresting to Natasha, she positively did not understand them. These questions, then as now, existed only for those who see nothing in marriage but the pleasure married people get from one another, that is, only the beginnings of marriage, and not its whole significance, which lies in the family. Discussions and questions of that kind, which are like the question of how to get the greatest gratification from one's dinner, did not then and do not now exist for those for whom the purpose of a dinner is the nourishment it affords, and the purpose of marriage is the family. If the purpose of dinner is to nourish the body, a man who eats 2 dinners at once may perhaps get more enjoyment, but will not attain his purpose, for his stomach will not digest the 2 dinners. If the purpose of marriage is the family, the person who wishes to have many wives or husbands may perhaps obtain much pleasure, but in that case will not have a family. If the purpose of food is nourishment, and the purpose of marriage is the family, the whole question resolves itself into not eating more than one can digest, and not having more wives or husbands than are needed for the family, that is, 1 wife or 1 husband. Natasha needed a husband. A husband was given to her, and he gave her a family, and she not only saw no need of any other or better husband, but as all the powers of her soul were intent on serving that husband and family, she could not imagine and saw no interest in imagining how it would be if things were different. Natasha did not care for society in general, but prized more the society of her relatives, Countess Mary and her brother, her mother and Sonia. She valued the company of those to whom she could come striding dishevelled from the nursery in her dressing gown, and with a joyful face show a yellow instead of a green stain on a baby's napkin, and from whom she could hear reassuring words to the effect that the baby was much better. To such an extent had Natásha let herself go that the way she dressed and did her hair, her ill-chosen words, and her jealousy—she was jealous of Sónya, of the governess, of every woman, pretty or plain—were habitual subjects of jest to those about her. The general opinion was that Pierre was under his wife's thumb, which really was true. From the very first days of their married life Natásha had announced her demands. Pierre was greatly surprised by his wife's view, to him a perfectly novel one, that every moment of his life belonged to her and to the family. His wife's demands astonished him, but they also flattered him, and he submitted to them. Pierre's subjection consisted in the fact that he not only dared not flirt with, but dared not even speak smilingly to, any other woman. Did not dare dine at the club as a pastime, did not dare spend money on a whim, did not dare absent himself for any length of time, except on business, in which his wife included his intellectual pursuits, which she did not in the least understand, but to which she attributed great importance. To make up for this, at home Pierre had the right to regulate his life and that of the whole family exactly as he chose. At home Natásha placed herself in the position of a slave to her husband, and the whole household went on tiptoe when he was occupied, that is, was reading or writing in his study. Pierre had but to show a partiality for anything to get just what he liked done always. He had only to express a wish and Natásha would jump up and run to fulfill it. The entire household was governed according to Pierre's supposed orders, that is, by his wishes which Natásha tried to guess. Their way of life and place of residence, their acquaintances and ties, Natásha's occupations, the children's upbringing were all selected not merely with regard to Pierre's expressed wishes, but to what Natásha, from the thoughts he expressed in conversation, supposed his wishes to be. And she deduced the essentials of his wishes quite correctly, and having once arrived at them clung to them tenaciously. When Pierre himself wanted to change his mind she would fight with him with his own weapons. Thus, in a time of trouble ever memorable to him, after the birth of their first child, who was delicate, when they had to change the wet nurse 3 times and Natásha fell ill from despair, Pierre one day told her of Rousseau's view, with which he quite agreed, that to have a wet nurse is unnatural and harmful. When her next baby was born, despite the opposition of her mother, the doctors, and even of her husband himself, who were all vigorously opposed to her nursing her baby herself, a thing then unheard of and considered injurious, she insisted on having her own way, and after that nursed all her babies herself. It very often happened that in a moment of irritation husband and wife would have a dispute. But long afterwards, Pierre, to his surprise and delight, would find in his wife's ideas and actions the very thought against which she had argued, but divested of everything superfluous that in the excitement of the dispute he had added when expressing his opinion. After 7 years of marriage, Pierre had the joyous and firm consciousness that he was not a bad man, and he felt this because he saw himself reflected in his wife. He felt the good and bad within himself inextricably mingled and overlapping, but only what was really good in him was reflected in his wife. All that was not quite good was rejected, and this was not the result of logical reasoning, but was a direct and mysterious reflection. End of first epilogue, chapter 10. This recording is in the public domain.
Epilogue, chapter 11. Read for LibriVox.org by Kate Mackenzie. 2 months previously, when Pierre was already staying with the Rostóvs, he had received a letter from Prince Theodore asking him to come to Petersburg to confer on some important questions that were being discussed there by a society of which Pierre was one of the principal founders. On reading that letter, she always read her husband's letters, Natásha herself suggested that he should go to Petersburg, though she would feel his absence very acutely. She attributed immense importance to all her husband's intellectual and abstract interests, though she did not understand them, and she always dreaded being a hindrance to him in such matters. To Pierre's timid look of inquiry, after reading the letter, she replied by asking him to go, but to fix a definite date for his return. He was given 4 weeks' leave of absence. Ever since that leave of absence had expired, more than a fortnight before, Natásha had been in a constant state of alarm, depression, and irritability. Denísov, Now a general on the retired list, and much dissatisfied with the present state of affairs, had arrived during that fortnight. He looked at Natásha with sorrow and surprise, as at a bad likeness of a person once dear. A dull, dejected look, random replies, and talk about the nursery was all he saw and heard from his former enchantress. Natásha was sad and irritable all that time, especially when her mother, her brother, Sónya, or Countess Mary, in their efforts to console her, tried to excuse Pierre and suggested reasons for his delay in returning. "It's all nonsense, all rubbish, those discussions which lead to nothing, and all those idiotic societies," Natásha declared of the very affairs in the immense importance of which she firmly believed. And she would go to the nursery to nurse Pétya, her only boy. No one else could tell her anything so comforting or so reasonable as this little 3-month-old creature, when he lay at her breast and she was conscious of the movement of his lips and the snuffling of his little nose. That creature said, "You are angry, you are jealous, you would like to pay him out, you are afraid, but here am I, and I am he," and that was unanswerable. It was more than true. During that fortnight of anxiety, Natásha resorted to the baby for comfort so often, and fussed over him so much, that she overfed him and he fell ill. She was terrified by his illness, and yet that was just what she needed. While attending to him, she bore the anxiety about her husband more easily. She was nursing her boy when the sound of Pierre's sleigh was heard at the front door, and the old nurse, knowing how to please her mistress, entered the room inaudibly but hurriedly and with a beaming face. "Has he come?" Natásha asked quickly in a whisper, afraid to move lest she should rouse the dozing baby. "He's come, ma'am," whispered the nurse. The blood rushed to Natásha's face and her feet involuntarily moved, but she could not jump up and run out. The baby again opened his eyes and looked at her. "You're here?" he seemed to be saying, and again lazily smacked his lips. Cautiously withdrawing her breast, Natásha rocked him a little, handed him to the nurse, and went with rapid steps towards the door. But at the door she stopped, as if her conscience reproached her for having in her joy left the child too soon, and she glanced round. The nurse with raised elbows was lifting the infant over the rail of his cot. "Go, ma'am, don't worry, go," she whispered, smiling with the kind of familiarity that grows up between a nurse and her mistress. Natásha ran with light footsteps to the anteroom. Denísov, who had come out of the study into the dancing room with his pipe, now for the first time recognized the old Natásha. A flood of brilliant, joyful light poured from her transfigured face. "He's come!" she exclaimed as she ran past, and Denísov felt that he too was delighted that Pierre, whom he did not much care for, had returned. On reaching the vestibule, Natásha saw a tall figure in a fur coat unwinding his scarf. "It's he! It's really he! He has come!" she said to herself, and rushing at him embraced him, pressed his head to her breast, and then pushed him back and gazed at his ruddy, happy face covered with hoarfrost. "Yes, it is he, happy and contented." Then all at once she remembered the tortures of suspense she had experienced for the last fortnight, and the joy that had lit up her face vanished. She frowned, and overwhelmed Pierre with a torrent of reproaches and angry words. "Yes, it's all very well for you. You are pleased, you've had a good time. But what about me? You might at least have shown consideration for the children. I am nursing and my milk was spoiled. Pétya was at death's door, but you were enjoying yourself, yes, enjoying." Pierre knew he was not to blame, for he could not have come sooner. He knew this outburst was unseemly and would blow over in a minute or two. Above all, he knew that he himself was bright and happy. He wanted to smile, but dared not even think of doing so. He made a piteous, frightened face and bent down. "I could not, on my honor. But how is Pétya?" "All right now, come along. I wonder you're not ashamed. If only you could see what I was like without you, how I suffered." "You are well?" "Come, come," she said, not letting go of his arm, and they went to their rooms. When Nicholas and his wife came to look for Pierre, he was in the nursery holding his baby son, who was again awake, on his huge right palm and dandling him. A blissful, bright smile was fixed on the baby's broad face with its toothless open mouth. The storm was long since over, and there was bright, joyous sunshine on Natásha's face as she gazed tenderly at her husband and child. "And have you talked everything well over with Prince Theodore?" she asked. "Yes, capitally." "You see, he holds it up." She meant the baby's head. "But how he did frighten me! You've seen the princess? Is it true she's in love with that? Yes, just fancy." At that moment Nicholas and Countess Mary came in. Pierre, with the baby on his hand, stooped, kissed them, and replied to their inquiries. But in spite of much that was interesting and had to be discussed, the baby with the little cap on its unsteady head evidently absorbed all his attention. "How sweet!" said Countess Mary, looking at and playing with the baby. "Now, Nicholas," she added, turning to her husband, "I can't understand how it is you don't see the charm of these delicious marvels." "I don't and can't," replied Nicholas, looking coldly at the baby. "A lump of flesh. Come along, Pierre." "And yet he's such an affectionate father," said Countess Mary, vindicating her husband, "but only after they are a year old or so." "Now Pierre nurses them splendidly," said Natásha. "He says his hand is just made for a baby's seat. Just look." "Only not for this!" Pierre suddenly exclaimed with a laugh, and shifting the baby he gave him to the nurse. End of chapter 11. This recording is in the public domain.
First Epilogue, Chapter 12. Read for LibriVox.org by Dave. Chapter 12. As in every large household, there were at Bald Hills several perfectly distinct worlds, which merged into one harmonious whole, though each retained its own peculiarities, and made concessions to the others. Every event, joyful or sad, that took place in that house was important to all these worlds, but each had its own special reasons to rejoice or grieve over that occurrence independently of the others. For instance, Pierre's return was a joyful and important event, and they all felt it to be so. The servants, the most reliable judges of their masters, because they judged not by their conversation or expressions of feeling, but by their acts and way of life, were glad of Pierre's return, because they knew that when he was there Count Nicholas would cease going every day to attend to the estate, and would be in better spirits and temper, and also because they would all receive handsome presents for the holidays. The children and their governesses were glad of Pierre's return, because no one else drew them into the social life of the household as he did. He alone could play on the clavichord that écossaise, his only piece, to which, as he said, all possible dances could be danced, and they felt sure he had brought presents for them all. Young Nicholas, now a slim lad of 15, delicate and intelligent, with curly light brown hair and beautiful eyes, was delighted, because Uncle Pierre, as he called him, was the object of his rapturous and passionate affection. No one had instilled into him this love for Pierre, whom he saw only occasionally. Countess Mary, who had brought him up, had done her utmost to make him love her husband as she loved him, and little Nicholas did love his uncle, but loved him with just a shade of contempt. Pierre, however, he adored. He did not want to be a hussar or a knight of St. George like his uncle Nicholas. He wanted to be learned, wise, and kind like Pierre. In Pierre's presence his face always shone with pleasure, and he flushed and was breathless when Pierre spoke to him. He did not miss a single word he uttered, and would afterwards, with Dessalles or by himself, recall and consider the meaning of everything Pierre had said. Pierre's past life and his unhappiness prior to 1812, of which young Nicholas had formed a vague poetic picture from some words he had overheard, his adventures in Moscow, his captivity, Platon Karateev, of whom he had heard from Pierre, his love for Natasha, of whom the lad was also particularly fond, and especially Pierre's friendship with the father whom Nicholas could not remember. All this made Pierre in his eyes a hero and a saint. From broken remarks about Natasha and his father, from the emotion with which Pierre spoke of that dead father, and from the careful, reverent tenderness with which Natasha spoke of him, the boy, who was only just beginning to guess what love is, derived the notion that his father had loved Natasha, and when dying had left her to his friend. But the father whom the boy did not remember appeared to him a divinity who could not be pictured, and of whom he never thought without a swelling heart and tears of sadness and rapture. So the boy also was happy that Pierre had arrived. The guests welcomed Pierre, because he always helped to enliven and unite any company he was in. The grown-up members of the family, not to mention his wife, were pleased to have back a friend whose presence made life run more smoothly and peacefully. The old ladies were pleased with the presents he brought them, and especially that Natasha would now be herself again. Pierre felt the different outlooks of these various worlds, and made haste to satisfy all their expectations. Though the most absent-minded and forgetful of men, Pierre, with the aid of a list his wife drew up, had now bought everything, not forgetting his mother and brother-in-law's commissions, nor the dress material for a present to Belova, nor toys for his wife's nephews. In the early days of his marriage, it had seemed strange to him that his wife should expect him not to forget to procure all the things he undertook to buy, and he had been taken aback by her serious annoyance when on his first trip he forgot everything. But in time he grew used to this demand. Knowing that Natasha asked nothing for herself, and gave him commissions for others only when he himself had offered to undertake them, he now found an unexpected and childlike pleasure in this purchasing of presents for everyone in the house, and never forgot anything. If he now incurred Natasha's censure, it was only for buying too many and too expensive things. To her other defects, as most people thought them, but which to Pierre were qualities, of untidiness and neglect of herself, she now added stinginess. From the time that Pierre began life as a family man, on a footing entailing heavy expenditure, he had noticed to his surprise that he spent only half as much as before, and that his affairs, which had been in disorder of late, chiefly because of his first wife's debts, had begun to improve. Life was cheaper because it was circumscribed. That most expensive luxury, the kind of life that can be changed at any moment, was no longer his, nor did he wish for it. He felt that his way of life had now been settled once for all till death, and that to change it was not in his power, and so that way of life proved economical. With a merry, smiling face, Pierre was sorting his purchases. "What do you think of this?" said he, unrolling a piece of stuff like a shopman. Natasha, who was sitting opposite to him, with her eldest daughter on her lap, turned her sparkling eyes swiftly from her husband to the things he showed her. "That's for Belova? Excellent!" She felt the quality of the material. "It was a rouble an arshin, I suppose?" Pierre told her the price. "Too dear," Natasha remarked. "How pleased the children will be, and Mamma too. Only you need not have brought me this," she added, unable to suppress a smile, as she gazed admiringly at a gold comb set with pearls, of a kind then just coming into fashion. "Adele tempted me. She kept on telling me to buy it," returned Pierre. "When am I to wear it?" And Natasha stuck it in her coil of hair. "When I take little Masha into society? Perhaps they will be fashionable again by then. Well, let's go now." And collecting the presents, they went first to the nursery, and then to the old countess' rooms. The countess was sitting with her companion Belova, playing grand patience as usual, when Pierre and Natasha came into the drawing-room with parcels under their arms. The countess was now over 60, was quite grey, and wore a cap with a frill that surrounded her face. Her face had shriveled, her upper lip had sunk in, and her eyes were dim. After the deaths of her son and husband in such rapid succession, she felt herself a being accidentally forgotten in this world, and left without aim or object for her existence. She ate, drank, slept, or kept awake, but did not live. Life gave her no new impressions. She wanted nothing from life but tranquillity, and that tranquillity only death could give her. But until death came, she had to go on living. That is, to use her vital forces. A peculiarity one sees in very young children and very old people was particularly evident in her. Her life had no external aims, only a need to exercise her various functions and inclinations was apparent. She had to eat, sleep, think, speak, weep, work, give vent to her anger, and so on, merely because she had a stomach, a brain, muscles, nerves, and a liver. She did these things not under any external impulse, as people of the full vigour of life do, when behind the purpose for which they strive, that of exercising their functions, remains unnoticed. She talked only because she physically needed to exercise her tongue and lungs. She cried as a child does, because her nose had to be cleared, and so on. What for people in their full vigour is an aim, was for her evidently merely a pretext. Thus in the morning, especially if she had eaten anything rich the day before, she felt a need of being angry, and would choose as the handiest pretext Belova's deafness. She would begin to say something to her in a low tone from the other end of the room. "It seems a little warmer today, my dear," she would murmur, and when Belova replied, "Oh yes, they've come," she would mutter angrily, "Oh Lord, how stupid and deaf she is!" Another pretext would be her snuff, which would seem too dry, or too damp, or not rubbed fine enough. After these fits of irritability, her face would grow yellow, and her maids knew by infallible symptoms when Belova would be deaf, the snuff damp, and the Countess' face yellow. Just as she needed to work off her spleen, so she had sometimes to exercise her still existing faculty of thinking, and the pretext for that was a game of patience. When she needed to cry, the deceased Count would be the pretext. When she wanted to be agitated, Nicholas and his health would be the pretext. And when she felt a need to speak spitefully, the pretext would be Countess Mary. When her vocal organs needed exercise, which was usually towards 7 o'clock, when she had had an after-dinner rest in a darkened room, the pretext would be the retelling of the same stories over and over again to the same audience. The old lady's condition was understood by the whole household, though no one ever spoke of it, and they all made every possible effort to satisfy her needs. Only by a rare glance, exchanged with a sad smile between Nicholas, Pierre, Natasha, and Countess Mary, was the common understanding of her condition expressed. But these glances expressed something more. They said that she had played her part in life, that what they now saw was not her whole self, that we must all become like her, and that they were glad to yield to her, to restrain themselves, for this once precious being, formerly as full of life as themselves, but now so much to be pitied. Memento mori, said these glances. Only the really heartless, the stupid ones of that household, and the little children, failed to understand this and avoided her. End of Chapter 12. Recording by Dave. This recording is in the public domain.
First Epilogue, Chapter 13, read for LibriVox.org by Kate Mackenzie. When Pierre and his wife entered the drawing-room, the Countess was in one of her customary states in which she needed the mental exertion of playing patience, and so, though by force of habit she greeted him with the words she always used when Pierre or her son returned after an absence, "High time, my dear, high time, we were all weary of waiting for you, well, thank God," and received her presents with another customary remark, "It's not the gift that's precious, my dear, but that you give it to me, an old woman." Yet it was evident that she was not pleased by Pierre's arrival at that moment, when it diverted her attention from the unfinished game. She finished her game of patience, and only then examined the presents. They consisted of a box for cards, of splendid workmanship, a bright blue Sèvres teacup with shepherdesses depicted on it and with a lid, and a gold snuff-box with the count's portrait on the lid, which Pierre had had done by a miniaturist in Petersburg. The countess had long wished for such a box, but as she did not want to cry just then, she glanced indifferently at the portrait, and gave her attentions chiefly to the box for cards. "Thank you, my dear, you have cheered me up," said she as she always did, "but best of all you have brought yourself back, for I never saw anything like it. You ought to give your wife a scolding. What are we to do with her? She is like a madwoman when you are away. Doesn't see anything, doesn't remember anything," she went on, repeating her usual phrases. "Look, Anna Timofeyevna," she added to her companion, "see what a box for cards my son has brought us." Belóva admired the presents and was delighted with her dress material. Though Pierre, Natásha, Nicholas, Countess Mary, and Denísov had much to talk about that they could not discuss before the old countess, not that anything was hidden from her, but because she had dropped so far behindhand in many things that had they begun to converse in her presence they would have had to answer inopportune questions and to repeat what they had already told her many times, that so and so was dead and so was married, which she would again be unable to remember. Yet they sat at tea round the samovar in the drawing-room from habit, and Pierre answered the countess's questions as to whether Prince Vasíli had aged and whether Countess Marie Alexéevna had sent greetings and still thought of them, and other matters that interested no one and to which she herself was indifferent. Conversation of this kind, interesting to no one yet unavoidable, continued all through tea-time. All the grown-up members of the family were assembled near the round tea-table at which Sónya presided beside the samovar. The children with their tutors and governesses had had tea and their voices were audible from the next room. At tea all sat in their accustomed places. Nicholas beside the stove at a small table where his tea was handed to him. Milka, the old grey borzoi bitch, daughter of the first milker, with a quite grey face and large black eyes that seemed more prominent than ever, lay on the armchair beside him. Denísov, whose curly hair, mustache, and whiskers had turned half grey, sat beside Countess Mary with his general's tunic unbuttoned. Pierre sat between his wife and the old countess. He spoke of what he knew might interest the old lady and that she could understand. He told her of external social events and of the people who had formed the circle of her contemporaries and had once been a real living and distinct group, but who were now for the most part scattered about the world and, like herself, were garnering the last ears of the harvests they had sown in earlier years. But to the old countess these contemporaries of hers seemed to be the only serious and real society. Natásha saw by Pierre's animation that his visit had been interesting, and that he had much to tell them but dare not say it before the old countess. Denísov, not being a member of the family, did not understand Pierre's caution, and being, as a malcontent, much interested in what was occurring in Petersburg, kept urging Pierre to tell them about what had happened in the Semënovsk region, then about Arakchéev, and then about the Bible Society. Once or twice Pierre was carried away and began to speak of these things, but Nicholas and Natásha always brought him back to the health of Prince Iván and Countess Mary Alexéevna. "Well, and all this idiocy, Gosna and Tatawinova?" Denísov asked. "Is that really still going on?" "Going on?" Pierre exclaimed. "Why, more than ever! The Bible Society is the whole government now." "What is that, mon cher ami?" asked the countess, who had finished her tea and evidently needed a pretext for being angry after her meal. "What are you saying about the government? I don't understand." "Well, you know, maman," Nicholas interposed, knowing how to translate things into his mother's language. "Prince Alexander Golítsyn has founded a society and in consequence has great influence, they say." "Arakchéev and Golítsyn," incautiously remarked Pierre, "and now the whole government, and what a government! They see treason everywhere and afraid of everything." "Well, and how is Prince Alexander to blame? He is a most estimable man. I used to meet him at Mary Antónovna's," said the countess in an offended tone. And still more offended that they all remained silent, she went on: "Nowadays everyone finds fault. A gospel society? Well, and what harm is there in that?" And she rose, everybody else got up too, and with a severe expression sailed back to her table in the sitting-room. The melancholy silence that followed was broken by the sounds of the children's voices and laughter from the next room. Evidently some jolly excitement was going on there. "Finished! Finished!" Little Natásha's gleeful yell rose above them all. Pierre exchanged glances with Countess Mary and Nicholas. Natásha he never lost sight of, and smiled happily. "That's delightful music," said he. "It means that Anna Makarovna has finished her stocking," said Countess Mary. "Oh, I'll go and see," said Pierre, jumping up. "You know," he added, stopping at the door, "why I'm especially fond of that music? It is always the first thing that tells me all is well. When I was driving here today, the nearer I got to the house the more anxious I grew. As I entered the ante-room I heard Andrúsha's peals of laughter, and that meant that all was well." I know that feeling," said Nicholas, "but I mustn't go there. Those stockings are to be a surprise for me." Pierre went to the children, and the shouting and laughter grew still louder. "Come, Anna Makarovna," Pierre's voice was heard saying, "come here into the middle of the room, and at the word of command, 1, 2, and when I say 3, you stand here and you in my arms. Well now, 1, 2, said Pierre, and a silence followed. 3, and a rapturously breathless cry of children's voices filled the room. 2, 2, they shouted. This meant 2 stockings, which by a secret process known only to herself, Anna Makarovna used to knit at the same time on the same needles, and which, when they were ready, she always triumphantly drew one out of the other in the children's presence. End of chapter 13. This recording is in the public domain.
First Epilogue, Chapter 14. Read for LibriVox.org by Dan Craig. Soon after this, the children came in to say good night. They kissed everyone, the tutors and governesses made their bows, and they went out. Only young Nicholas and his tutor remained. Dessalles whispered to the boy to come downstairs. "No, Monsieur Dessalles, I will ask my aunt to let me stay," replied Nicholas Bolkonsky, also in a whisper. "Ma tante, please let me stay," he said, going up to his aunt. His face expressed entreaty, agitation, and ecstasy. Countess Mary glanced at him and turned to Pierre. "When you are here, he can't tear himself away," she said. "I will bring him to you directly, Monsieur Dessalles. Good night," said Pierre, giving his hand to the Swiss tutor, and he turned to young Nicholas with a smile. "You and I haven't seen anything of one another yet. How like he is growing, Mary," he added, addressing Countess Mary. "Like my father?" asked the boy, flushing crimson and looking up at Pierre with bright, ecstatic eyes. Pierre nodded, and went on with what he had been saying when the children had interrupted. Countess Mary sat down doing wool work. Natasha did not take her eyes off her husband. Nicholas and Denísov rose, asked for their pipes, smoked, went to fetch more tea from Sónya, who sat weary but resolute at the samovar, and questioned Pierre. The curly-headed, delicate boy sat with shining eyes unnoticed in a corner, starting every now and then and muttering something to himself, and evidently experiencing a new and powerful emotion as he turned his curly head, with his thin neck exposed by his turned-down collar, toward the place where Pierre sat. The conversation turned on the contemporary gossip about those in power, in which most people see the chief interest of home politics. Denísov, dissatisfied with the government on account of his own disappointments in the service, heard with pleasure the things done in Petersburg, which seemed to him stupid, and made forcible and sharp comments on what Pierre told him. "One used to have to be a German. Now one must dance with Tatawanova and Madame Quediner and Wig Echterhausen and the Brethren. Oh, they should let that fine fellow Bonaparte loose. He'd knock all this nonsense out of them. Fancy giving the command of the Semenoff regiment to a fellow like that Schwartz," he cried. Nicholas, though free from Denísov's readiness to find fault with everything, also thought that discussion of the government was a very serious and weighty matter, and the fact that A had been appointed minister of this, and B governor-general of that, and that the emperor had said so-and-so, and this minister so-and-so, seemed to him very important. And so he thought it necessary to take an interest in these things and to question Pierre. The questions put by these two kept the conversation from changing its ordinary character of gossip about the higher government circles. But Natasha, knowing all her husband's ways and ideas, saw that he had long been wishing, but had been unable to divert the conversation to another channel and express his own deeply felt idea for the sake of which he had gone to Petersburg to consult with his new friend Prince Theodore, and she helped him by asking how his affairs with Prince Theodore had gone. "What was it about?" asked Nicholas. Always the same thing, said Pierre, looking round at his listeners. Everybody sees that things are going so badly that they cannot be allowed to go on so, and that it is the duty of all decent men to counteract it as far as they can. What can decent men do? Nicholas inquired, frowning slightly. What can be done? Why, this. Come into my study, said Nicholas. Natasha, who had long expected to be fetched to nurse her baby, now heard the nurse calling her and went to the nursery. Countess Mary followed her. The men went into the study, and little Nicholas Bolkonsky followed them unnoticed by his uncle, and sat down at the writing table in a shady corner by the window. Well, what would you do? Asked Denisov. Always some fantastic scheme, said Nicholas. Why, this, began Pierre, not sitting down but pacing the room, sometimes stopping short, gesticulating and lisping. The position in Petersburg is this. The emperor does not look into anything. He has abandoned himself altogether to this mysticism. Pierre could not tolerate mysticism in anyone now. He seeks only for peace, and only these people sans foi ni loi, without faith or law, can give it to him. People who recklessly hack at and strangle everything. Magnitsky, Archiv, and tutti quanti. You will agree that if you did not look after your estates yourself, but only wanted a quiet life, the harsher your steward was, the more readily your object might be attained, he said to Nicholas. Well, what does that lead up to? Said Nicholas. Well, everything is going to ruin. Robbery in the law courts, in the army nothing but flogging, drilling, and military settlements. The people are tortured, enlightenment is suppressed. All that is young and honest is crushed. Everyone sees that this cannot go on. Everything is strained to such a degree that it will certainly break, said Pierre, as those who examine the actions of any government have always said since governments began. I told them just one thing in Petersburg. Told whom? Well, you know whom, said Pierre, with a meaning glance from under his brows. Prince Theodore and all those. To encourage culture and philanthropy is all very well, of course. The aim is excellent, but in the present circumstances something else is needed. At that moment Nicholas noticed the presence of his nephew. His face darkened, and he went up to the boy. Why are you here? Why, let him be, said Pierre, taking Nicholas by the arm and continuing. That is not enough, I told him. Something else is needed. When you stand expecting the overstrained string to snap at any moment, when everyone is expecting the inevitable catastrophe, as many as possible must join hands as closely as they can to withstand the general calamity. Everything that is young and strong is being enticed away and depraved. One is lured by women, another by honors, a third by ambition or money, and they go over to that camp. No independent men, such as you or I, are left. What I say is widen the scope of our society. Let the mot d'ordre not be virtue alone, but independence and action as well. Nicholas, who had left his nephew, irritably pushed up an armchair, sat down in it, and listened to Pierre, coughing discontentedly and frowning more and more. But action with what aim? He cried, and what position will you adopt toward the government? Why, the position of assistants. The society need not be secret if the government allows it. Not merely is it not hostile to government, but it is a society of true conservatives, a society of gentlemen in the full meaning of that word. It is only to prevent some Pugachev or other from killing my children and yours, and our chief from sending me off to some military settlement. We join hands only for the public welfare and the general safety. Yes, but it's a secret society, and therefore a hostile and harmful one, which can only cause harm. Why, did the Tugendbund, which saved Europe? They did not then venture to suggest that Russia had saved Europe. Do any harm? The Tugendbund is an alliance of virtue. It is love, mutual help. It is what Christ preached on the cross. Natasha, who had come in during this conversation, looked joyfully at her husband. It was not what he was saying that pleased her. That did not even interest her, for it seemed to her that it was all extremely simple, and that she had known it a long time. It seemed so to her because she knew that it sprang from Pierre's whole soul. But it was his animated and enthusiastic appearance that made her glad. The boy with the thin neck stretching out from the turned-down collar, whom everyone had forgotten, gazed at Pierre with even greater and more rapturous joy. Every word of Pierre's burned into his heart, and with a nervous movement of his fingers he unconsciously broke the sealing wax and quill pens his hand came upon on his uncle's table. It is not at all what you suppose, but that is what the German Tugendbund was, and what I am proposing. No, my friend, the Tugendbund is all very well for the sausage-eaters, but I don't understand it, and can't even pronounce it, interposed Denísov in a loud and resolute voice. I agree that everything here is rotten and horrible, but the Tugendbund I don't understand. If we're not satisfied, let us have a Bund of our own. That's all right. Je suis votre homme. I'm your man. Pierre smiled. Natasha began to laugh, but Nicholas knitted his brows still more and began proving to Pierre that there was no prospect of any great change, and that all the danger he spoke of existed only in his imagination. Pierre maintained the contrary, and as his mental faculties were greater and more resourceful, Nicholas felt himself cornered. This made him still angrier, for he was fully convinced, not by reasoning, but by something within him stronger than reason, of the justice of his opinion. I will tell you this, he said, rising and trying with nervously twitching fingers to prop up his pipe in a corner, but finally abandoning the attempt. I can't prove it to you. You say that everything here is rotten, and that an overthrow is coming. I don't see it. But you also say that our oath of allegiance is a conditional matter. And to that I reply, you are my best friend, as you know, but if you formed a secret society, began working against the government, be it what it may, I know it is my duty to obey the government. And if our chief ordered me to lead a squadron against you and cut you down, I should not hesitate an instant, but should do it. And you may argue about that as you like. An awkward silence followed these words. Natasha was the first to speak, defending her husband and attacking her brother. Her defense was weak and inapt, but she attained her object. The conversation was resumed, and no longer in the unpleasantly hostile tones of Nicholas's last remark. When they all got up to go into supper, little Nicholas Bolkonsky went up to Pierre, pale and with shining, radiant eyes. Uncle Pierre, No. If Papa were alive, would he agree with you? He asked. And Pierre suddenly realized what a special, independent, complex, and powerful process of thought and feeling must have been going on in this boy during that conversation. And remembering all he had said, he regretted that the lad should have heard him. He had, however, to give him an answer. Yes, I think so, he said reluctantly, and left the study. The lad looked down and seemed now for the first time to notice what he had done to the things on the table. He flushed and went up to Nicholas. Uncle, forgive me, I did that unintentionally, he said, pointing to the broken sealing wax and pens. Nicholas started angrily. All right, he said, throwing the bits under the table. And evidently suppressing his vexation with difficulty, he turned away from the boy. You ought not to have been here at all, he said. End of chapter 14. This recording is in the public domain.
First Epilogue, Chapter 15, read for LibriVox.org by Kate Mackenzie. The conversation at supper was not about politics or societies, but turned on the subject Nicholas liked best, recollections of 1812. Denísov started these, and Pierre was particularly agreeable and amusing about them. The family separated on the most friendly terms. After supper, Nicholas, having undressed in his study and given instructions to the steward who had been waiting for him, went to the bedroom in his dressing gown, where he found his wife still at her table, writing. "What are you writing, Mary?" Nicholas asked. Countess Mary blushed. She was afraid that what she was writing would not be understood or approved by her husband. She had wanted to conceal what she was writing from him, but at the same time was glad he had surprised her at it, and that she would now have to tell him. "A diary, Nicholas," she replied, handing him a blue exercise book filled with her firm, bold writing. "A diary?" Nicholas repeated with a shade of irony, and he took up the book. It was in French. December 4th. Today, when Andrusha, her eldest boy, woke up he did not wish to dress, and Mademoiselle Louise sent for me. He was naughty and obstinate. I tried threats, but he only grew angrier. Then I took the matter in hand. I left him alone and began with nurse's help to get the other children up, telling him that I did not love him. For a long time he was silent, as if astonished. Then he jumped out of bed, ran to me in his shirt, and sobbed, so that I could not calm him for a long time. It was plain that what troubled him most was that he had grieved me. Afterwards, in the evening, when I gave him his ticket, he began again crying piteously and kissing me. One can do anything with him by tenderness. "What is a ticket?" Nicholas inquired. "I have begun giving the elder ones marks every evening, showing how they have behaved." Nicholas looked into the radiant eyes that were gazing at him, and continued to turn over the pages and read. In the diary was set down everything in the children's lives that seemed noteworthy to their mother, as showing their characters, or suggesting general reflections on educational methods. They were, for the most part, quite insignificant trifles, but did not seem so to the mother or to the father either, now that he read this diary about his children for the first time. Under the date 5th was entered: "Mitya was naughty at table. Papa said he was to have no pudding. He had none, but looked so unhappily and greedily at the others while they were eating. I think that punishment by depriving children of sweets only develops their greediness. Must tell Nicholas this." Nicholas put down the book and looked at his wife. The radiant eyes gazed at him questioningly. Would he approve or disapprove of her diary? There could be no doubt not only of his approval, but also of his admiration for his wife. Perhaps it need not be done so pedantically, thought Nicholas, or even done at all, but this untiring, continual spiritual effort, of which the sole aim was the children's moral welfare, delighted him. Had Nicholas been able to analyse his feelings, he would have found that his steady, tender, and proud love of his wife rested on his feeling of wonder at her spirituality and at the lofty moral world, almost beyond his reach, in which she had her being. He was proud of her intelligence and goodness, recognized his own insignificance beside her in the spiritual world, and rejoiced all the more that she, with such a soul, not only belonged to him, but was part of himself. "I quite approve, my dearest," said he with a significant look, and after a short pause he added, "and I behaved badly today. You weren't in the study. We began disputing, Pierre and I, and I lost my temper. But he is impossible! Such a child! I don't know what would become of him if Natasha didn't keep him in hand. Have you any idea why he went to Petersburg? They have formed—" "Yes, I know," said Countess Mary. "Natasha told me." "Well then, you know," Nicholas went on, growing hot at the mere recollection of their discussion. "He wanted to convince me that it is every honest man's duty to go against the government, and that the oath of allegiance and duty—I'm sorry you weren't there. They all fell on me, Denísov and Natasha. Natasha is absurd. How she rules over him! And yet there need only be a discussion, and she has no words of her own, but only repeats his sayings," added Nicholas, yielding to that irresistible inclination which tempts us to judge those nearest and dearest to us. He forgot that what he was saying about Natasha could have been applied word for word to himself in relation to his wife. "Yes, I have noticed that," said Countess Mary. "When I told him that duty and the oath were above everything, he started proving goodness knows what. A pity you were not there. What would you have said?" "As I see it, you were quite right, and I told Natasha so. Pierre says everybody is suffering, tortured, and being corrupted, and that it is our duty to help our neighbour. Of course, he is right there," said Countess Mary, "but he forgets that we have other duties nearer to us, duties indicated to us by God himself, and that though we might expose ourselves to risk, we must not risk our children." "Yes, that's it, that's just what I said to him," put in Nicholas, who fancied he really had said it. But they insisted on their own view, love of one's neighbour and Christianity, and all this in the presence of young Nicholas, who had gone into my study and broke all my things. Ah, Nicholas, do you know I am often troubled about little Nicholas?" said Countess Mary. "He is such an exceptional boy. I am afraid I neglect him in favour of my own. We all have children and relations, while he has no one. He is constantly alone with his thoughts." "Well, I don't think you need reproach yourself on his account. All that the fondest mother could do for her son you have done, and are doing for him, and of course I am glad of it. He is a fine lad, a fine lad. This evening he listened to Pierre in a sort of trance, and fancy, as we were going in to supper, I looked, and he had broken everything on my table to bits, and he told me of it himself at once. I never knew him to tell an untruth. A fine lad, a fine lad," repeated Nicholas, who at heart was not fond of Nicholas Bolkónski, and was always anxious to recognize that he was a fine lad. "Still, I am not the same as his own mother," said Countess Mary. "I feel I am not the same, and it troubles me. A wonderful boy, but I am dreadfully afraid for him. It would be good for him to have companions." "Well, it won't be for long. Next summer I'll take him to Petersburg," said Nicholas. "Yes, Pierre was always a dreamer and always will be," he continued, returning to the talk in the study which had evidently disturbed him. "Well, what business is it of mine what goes on there? Whether Arakchéev is bad and all that, what business was it of mine when I married and was so deep in debt that I was threatened with prison, and had a mother who could not see or understand it? And then there are you and the children and our affairs. Is it for my own pleasure that I am at the farm or in the office from morning to night? No, but I know I must work to comfort my mother, to repay you, and not to leave the children such beggars as I was." Countess Mary wanted to tell him that man does not live by bread alone, and that he attached too much importance to these matters. But she knew she must not say this, and that it would be useless to do so. She only took his hand and kissed it. He took this as a sign of approval and a confirmation of his thoughts, and after a few minutes' reflection continued to think aloud. "You know, Mary, today Elias Mitrofánich," this was his overseer, "came back from the Tambov estate and told me they are already offering 80,000 rubles for the forest." And with an eager face Nicholas began to speak of the possibility of repurchasing Otrádnoe before long, and added, "Another 10 years of life and I shall leave the children in an excellent position." Countess Mary listened to her husband and understood all that he told her. She knew that when he thought aloud in this way he would sometimes ask her what he had been saying, and be vexed if he noticed that she had been thinking about something else. But she had to force herself to attend, for what he was saying did not interest her at all. She looked at him and did not think, but felt about something different. She felt a submissive, tender love for this man who would never understand all that she understood, and this seemed to make her love for him still stronger, and added a touch of passionate tenderness. Besides this feeling which absorbed her altogether and hindered her from following the details of her husband's plans, thoughts that had no connection with what he was saying flitted through her mind. She thought of her nephew. Her husband's account of the boy's agitation while Pierre was speaking struck her forcibly, and various traits of his gentle, sensitive character recurred to her mind, and while thinking of her nephew, she thought also of her own children. She did not compare them with him, but compared her feeling for them with her feeling for him, and felt with regret that there was something lacking in her feeling for young Nicholas. Sometimes it seemed to her that this difference arose from the difference in their ages, but she felt herself to blame toward him, and promised in her heart to do better, and to accomplish the impossible. In this life, to love her husband, her children, little Nicholas, and all her neighbours as Christ loved mankind. Countess Mary's soul always strove towards the infinite, the eternal, and the absolute, and could therefore never be at peace. A stern expression of the lofty secret suffering of a soul burdened by the body appeared on her face. Nicholas gazed at her. "Oh God, what will become of us if she dies, as I always fear when her face is like that," thought he, and placing himself before the icon, he began to say his evening prayers. End of chapter 15. This recording is in the public domain.
Peace, First Epilogue, Chapter 16, read for LibriVox.org by Anna Simon. Natásha and Pierre, left alone, also began to talk as only a husband and wife can talk, that is, with extraordinary clearness and rapidity, understanding and expressing each other's thoughts in ways contrary to all rules of logic, without premises, deductions, or conclusions, and in a quite peculiar way. Natásha was so used to this kind of talk with her husband that for her it was the surest sign of something being wrong between them if Pierre followed a line of logical reasoning. When he began proving anything, or talking argumentatively and calmly, and she, led on by his example, began to do the same, she knew that they were on the verge of a quarrel. From the moment they were alone, and Natásha came up to him with wide open happy eyes, and quickly seizing his head pressed it to her bosom, saying, "Now you're all mine, mine, you won't escape." From that moment this conversation began, contrary to all the laws of logic and contrary to them, because quite different subjects were talked about at one and the same time. This simultaneous discussion of many topics did not prevent a clear understanding, but on the contrary was the surest sign that they fully understood one another. Just as in a dream when all is uncertain, unreasoning, and contradictory, except the feeling that guides the dream, so in this intercourse, contrary to all laws of reason, the words themselves were not consecutive and clear, but only the feeling that prompted them. Natásha spoke to Pierre about her brother's life and doings, of how she had suffered and lacked life during his own absence, and of how she was fonder than ever of Mary, and how Mary was in every way better than herself. In saying this, Natásha was sincere in acknowledging Mary's superiority, but at the same time by saying it she made a demand on Pierre that he should, all the same, prefer her to Mary and to all other women, and that now, especially after having seen many women in Petersburg, he should tell her so afresh. Pierre, answering Natásha's words, told her how intolerable it had been for him to meet ladies at dinners and balls in Petersburg. "I've quite lost the knack of talking to ladies," he said. "It was simply dull. Besides, I was very busy." Natásha looked intently at him and went on. "Mary is so splendid," said she. "How she understands children! It is as if she saw straight into their souls. Yesterday, for instance, Mitya was naughty." "How like his father he is!" Pierre interjected. Natásha knew why he mentioned Mitya's likeness to Nicholas. The recollection of his dispute with his brother-in-law was unpleasant, and he wanted to know what Natásha thought of it. "Nicholas has the weakness of never agreeing with anything not generally accepted. But I understand that you value what opens up a fresh line," said she, repeating words Pierre had once uttered. "No, the chief point is that to Nicholas ideas and discussions are an amusement, almost a pastime," said Pierre. "For instance, he is collecting a library and has made it a rule not to buy a new book till he has read what he had already bought. Sismondi and Rousseau and Montesquieu," he added with a smile. "You know how much I..." He began to soften down what he had said, but Natásha interrupted him to show that this was unnecessary. "So you say ideas are an amusement to him?" "Yes, and for me nothing else is serious. All the time in Petersburg I saw everyone as in a dream. When I am taken up by a thought, all else is mere amusement." "Ah, I'm so sorry I wasn't there when you met the children," said Natásha. "Which was most delighted? Lisa, I'm sure." "Yes," Pierre replied, and went on with what was in his mind. "Nicholas says we ought not to think. But I can't help it. Besides, when I was in Petersburg I felt, I can say this to you, that the whole affair would go to pieces without me. Everyone was pulling his own way. But I succeeded in uniting them all. And then my idea is so clear and simple. You see, I don't say that we ought to oppose this and that. We may be mistaken. What I say is, join hands, you who love the right, and let there be but one banner, that of active virtue. Prince Sergei is a fine fellow and clever." Natásha would have had no doubt as to the greatness of Pierre's idea, but one thing disconcerted her. "Can a man so important and necessary to society be also my husband? How did this happen?" She wished to express this doubt to him. "Now, who could decide whether he is really cleverer than all the others?" she asked herself, and passed in review all those whom Pierre most respected. Judging by what he had said, there was no one he had respected so highly as Platon Karatáev. "Do you know what I'm thinking about?" she asked. "About Platon Karatáev. Would he have approved of you now, do you think?" Pierre was not at all surprised at this question. He understood his wife's line of thought. "Platon Karatáev?" he repeated, and pondered, evidently sincerely trying to imagine Karatáev's opinion on the subject. He would not have understood. Yet perhaps he would. "I love you awfully," Natásha suddenly said. "Awfully, awfully." "No, he would not have approved," said Pierre, after reflection. "What he would have approved of is our family life. He was always so anxious to find seemliness, happiness, and peace in everything, and I should have been proud to let him see us. There now, you talk of my absence, but you wouldn't believe what a special feeling I have for you after separation." "Yes, I should think..." Natásha began. "No, it's not that. I never leave off loving you, and one couldn't love more, but this is something special." "Yes, of course." He did not finish, because their eyes meeting said the rest. "What nonsense it is," Natásha suddenly exclaimed, "about honeymoons, and that the greatest happiness is at first. On the contrary, now is the best of all. If only he did not go away. Do you remember how we quarreled? And it was always my fault, always mine. And what we quarreled about, I don't even remember." "Always about the same thing," said Pierre with a smile. "Don't say it! I can't bear it!" Natásha cried, and her eyes glittered coldly and vindictively. "Did you see her?" she added after a pause. "No, and if I had, I shouldn't have recognized her." They were silent for a while. "Oh, do you know, while you were talking in the study I was looking at you," Natásha began, evidently anxious to disperse the cloud that had come over them. "You're as like him as two peas, like the boy." She meant her little son. "Oh, it's time to go to him. The milk's come. But I'm sorry to leave you." They were silent for a few seconds. Then suddenly turning to one another at the same time, they both began to speak. Pierre began with self-satisfaction and enthusiasm. Natásha with a quiet, happy smile. Having interrupted one another, they both stopped to let the other continue. "No, what did you say? Go on, go on." "No, you go on. I was talking nonsense," said Natásha. Pierre finished what he had begun. It was the sequel to his complacent reflections on his success in Petersburg. At that moment it seemed to him that he was chosen to give a new direction to the whole of Russian society and to the whole world. "I only wish to say that ideas that have great results are always simple ones. My whole idea is that if vicious people are united and constitute a power, then honest folk must do the same. Now, that's simple enough." "Yes. And what were you going to say?" "I? Only nonsense." "But all the same?" "Oh, nothing, only a trifle," said Natásha, smilingly still more brightly. "I only wanted to tell you about Pétya. Today Nurse was coming to take him from me, and he laughed, shut his eyes and clung to me. I'm sure he thought he was hiding. Awfully sweet. There, now he's crying. Well, good-bye," and she left the room. Meanwhile, downstairs in young Nicholas Bolkónski's bedroom, a little lamp was burning as usual. The boy was afraid of the dark and they could not cure him of it. Dessalles slept propped up on 4 pillows, and his Roman nose emitted sounds of rhythmic snoring. Little Nicholas, who had just waked up in a cold perspiration, sat up in bed and gazed before him with wide open eyes. He had awaked from a terrible dream. He had dreamt that he and Uncle Pierre, wearing helmets such as were depicted in his Plutarch, were leading a huge army. The army was made up of white slanting lines that filled the air like the cobwebs that float about in autumn, and which Dessalles had called les filles de la Vierge. In front was glory, which was similar to those threads but rather thicker. He and Pierre were borne along lightly and joyously, nearer and nearer to their goal. Suddenly the threads that moved them began to slacken and become entangled, and it grew difficult to move, and Uncle Nicholas stood before them in a stern and threatening attitude. "Have you done this?" he said, pointing to some broken sealing wax and pens. "I loved you, but I've orders from Arakchéev and will kill the first of you who moves forward." Little Nicholas turned to look at Pierre, but Pierre was no longer there. In his place was his father, Prince Andrew, and his father had neither shape nor form, but he existed. And when little Nicholas perceived him, he grew faint with love. He felt himself powerless, limp and formless. His father caressed and pitied him. But Uncle Nicholas came nearer and nearer to them. Terror seized young Nicholas, and he awoke. "My father!" he thought. Though there were two good portraits of Prince Andrew in the house, Nicholas never imagined him in human form. "My father has been with me and caressed me. He approved of me and of Uncle Pierre. Whatever he may tell me, I will do it. Monsieur Scaevola burned his hand. Why should not the same sort of thing happen to me? I know they want me to learn, and I will learn. But some day I shall have finished learning, and then I will do something. I only pray God that something may happen to me such as happened to Plutarch's men, and I will act as they did. I will do better. Everyone shall know me, love me, and be delighted with me." And suddenly his bosom heaved with sobs, and he began to cry. "Are you ill?" he heard Dessalles' voice asking. "No," answered Nicholas, and lay back on his pillow. "He is good and kind, and I am fond of him," he thought of Dessalles. "But Uncle Pierre, oh, what a wonderful man he is! And my father? Oh, father, father! Yes, I will do something with which even he would be satisfied." End of chapter 16. End of War and Peace, First Epilogue, by Leo Tolstoy. This recording is in the public domain.